Easy wins. When you get a big reward for literally the least amount of effort. When you tell your significant other that they look beautiful. When you go to a rock concert and the lead singer shouts the name of the city you're in. Both take basically no effort at all, but they get an immensely positive reaction nonetheless. In the world of gaming, I think the best example of a recent easy win is when Sony ported Bloodborne over to the PC and gave it a 60 frames per second patch. I'm sorry, what's that? They haven't yet? Huh. I guess Sony doesn't like money! Okay, fine, then the other best example I had on the brain was Konami remaking Metal Gear Solid 3. What do you do when you're a universally hated corporation that no longer employs people that know how to make games anymore, and you want to try and get back into people's good graces? Simple. You take one of the greatest games ever made and port it into Unreal Engine 5, barely changing anything except for the graphics. Of all the ways that the Metal Gear franchise could have been reintroduced, remaking MGS3 literally required the lowest amount of effort and risk. But by God, is it making me and a lot of people happy. Still, if you look at things from a creative and audience-pleasing standpoint instead of a business standpoint, I wonder if remaking MGS3 first was the right choice. It might be. In my many years as a Metal Gear fan, all the evidence seems to suggest that people view MGS3 as the best and most beloved in the franchise, and that alone justifies Konami's choice. But that might only be true if you surveyed every type of Metal Gear fan, from the casual to the hardcore. If, however, you were to survey just the hardcore fans, I bet that they would almost universally say it should be the original MSX games, Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Granted, this would be the exact opposite of an easy win. And I admit, I don't trust that Konami, as the company is currently formulated, would be able to do remakes of these games properly. But in an ideal world, I would argue that the potential benefits far and away exceed remaking any of the other games first. Look, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Metal Gear fans have never played the original MSX games, and any knowledge they have of their existence or their content is limited to references in all the other games. Therefore, if remakes of Metal Gear 1 and 2 were made, most people who play them will at best know only the bullet points regarding their plots and settings, of which there are only a handful. In between those bullet points, there are innumerable opportunities to expand upon the characters, the world, and the gameplay, but still feel familiar enough so that it doesn't disrespect Hideo Kojima's original vision. I mean, any more than Konami already has. Best of all, you don't run the risk of pissing everybody off like you would if you remade the other heir apparent, Metal Gear Solid 1, where, because the game is so sacred and important to the video game medium, even the slightest change to the game's structure would invite massive scrutiny. As I reflected on the potential that these hypothetical remakes could have, I suddenly felt motivated to take a look back at the MSX games, at what things hold up and what things don't. In doing so, I felt that maybe I could offer up some ideas, as a longtime hardcore Metal Gear fan, as to how and why a remake or remakes of these games could turn into something legendary, something truly worthy of the Metal Gear brand. And that's what I intend to do today. Needless to say, there are spoilers ahead. The year is 1995. The American government has recently uncovered evidence that a weapon of mass destruction is being constructed somewhere in the South African wilderness, in a fortress known as Outer Heaven. After coming across this intel, a division of the US Army, known as High-Tech Special Forces Unit Foxhound, sent one of their best soldiers to infiltrate and investigate, a soldier codenamed Gray Fox. A few days after the infiltration began, the Army lost contact with Gray Fox, with his last transmission being a mere 2 words: Metal Gear. Following this, the commander of Foxhound, codenamed Big Boss, decided to send the newest member of their unit to rescue Gray Fox and destroy this new weapon. And that soldier was Solid Snake. Beyond this synopsis, any semblance of a story in this game is borderline non-existent. At no point do any of the themes that the Metal Gear franchise is famous for show up. Stuff like the horrors of war or the convoluted morality of world politics had yet to be introduced. What story is there is just used as the excuse to infiltrate the enemy fortress, save hostages, kill bad guys, shut up. And I'm sure that was more than fine for a game released in 1987. I'm sure the gameplay felt very immersive and exciting when it came out. But due to technical limitations at the time and the relative nascence of the video game medium, almost any game released in the 80s will simply not hold up 4 decades later in terms of gameplay or story. And unfortunately, Metal Gear is no exception. This game has a litany of problems that I wish to address, but before I get to that, I must give the game respect where it is mandated. Though Metal Gear is not technically the first stealth game, it is arguably the first mainstream stealth game, which was primarily due to the refinement of its core stealth gameplay. Granted, all you have to do is not be directly in front of a guard or camera, and even if you get caught, you can just run off screen to escape. I must admit though that there is a charm to the gameplay simplicity, even in 2024. Sometimes you don't need to have guards with peripheral vision or that can see you from a mile away for a stealth game to be fun. Even with an ancient game like the first Metal Gear, only having to worry about whether or not I was directly in front of the guard was fun in its own way. It also in part made me nostalgic for a simpler, more innocent time, something that modern games with modern graphics almost never recapture. For that alone, I think Metal Gear would be worth your time. But still, there are other positives beyond that. I love how the game incentivizes exploration by putting hostages all over the map. If you save enough of them, your life bar and your class level go up consecutively. In turn, a higher health bar makes future challenges easier, and a higher class level allows you to call a fellow operative named Jennifer that will hack doors for you, opening up different pathways. I mean, sure, the world is on the verge of nuclear holocaust, and it would help if she just opened the doors instead of being an uppity bitch about your class, but if you can ignore that, it does add a great feeling of challenge and eventual reward. And you know, you can always get revenge on Jennifer later.
You're Ames, aren't you?
My name's Jennifer.
Oh really? Isn't that interesting? Aside from all of this, it is cool to witness the origins of what makes up Metal Gear's core identity. You get boss battles, where each boss has a cool personality and gimmick. You get the first fourth wall break in the series when Big Boss tells you to turn off your system, which I bet was mind-blowing back in '87. It was that era's version of Psycho Mantis reading your memory card. This and everything else I mentioned elevate the game's quality enough to make me recommend people try the game, even in the year 2024. But having said all that, I hesitate to say that it's a good game. Because my god, there are some things about this game that drive me so nuts that I almost start banging my head against the floor Cyborg Ninja style. First of all, if you're a first-time player, completing this game will take you roughly 4 to 6 hours, which is fine, but a lot of that time is spent contending with really obtuse game design that makes no sense. For instance, at one point, you will need to find an enemy uniform that will allow you to gain access to a new part of the base. The only way to find it though is if you know the codec number of a character named Schneider, which you can easily miss early on. He will tell you that you will find the uniform in the basement by tapping on the walls, and then blowing up whichever wall makes a funny noise. If you miss his codec number, you will instantly lose an hour of your time unless you use a guide. Now again, I can forgive this and other moments like it in the game because the game was released in 1987. Game design choices like this weren't obviously bad. But then there are choices where it doesn't matter what year the game was made in, it should have been obvious that the choices were stupid. Why is it that Snake is able to escape his prison cell by punching through a wall? Why have the codec ring every time you enter the same area just so Big Boss can tell you the same freaking thing over and over? But the worst thing, the thing that makes my head explode like that dude in the movie Scanners, is the card key system.
no, please God, no.
Every time you go to open a door, you have to select each card key until you figure out which one works. There's no number on the door that tells you which card to use, and the cards don't stack like in the future games. So if you have a level 7 card, it won't work on doors 1 through 6. You have to use card 1 for a level 1 door, card 2 for a level 2 door, and so on. And you might think, well, maybe areas that open up later on in the game will just use the higher level cards, but no, they don't! Many areas will have a level 7 door and then a level 1 or 2 door next to it. Why? Why? The medicine! It's so obviously bad. And yet, Hideo Kojima kept the same card key system in the sequel, and in Metal Gear Solid 1, you still have to manually equip the key to open the door. He wouldn't fix the stupid system until Metal Gear Solid 2, which came out 14 years later. Kojima, I love you, man, but seriously, what the hell were you smoking back then? God, that made me angrier than I was expecting. Anyway, there are a few more aspects of this game that I want to address, but I will save those for this video's final segment where I speculate on how it could be remade. I will just close this segment by saying this. The first Metal Gear game is not good, but it gets enough stuff right, particularly the simple yet charming stealth gameplay, that there is still some enjoyment to be had 37 years later. Even if it might not click for you personally, it's still an important part of gaming history that every hardcore gamer should experience. Right up there with games like the original Mario Brothers, Zelda, Doom, Space Invaders, and others. Now, while I did just give Kojima a lot of criticism for not learning from his mistakes with the card key system, I can confidently say that that was an aberration, because he fixed almost all of the first game's other mistakes in the sequel. If I were to summarize Metal Gear 2 in a single sentence, I would say this. Is it as masterfully crafted as all the games that came after it? No, but for a game released in 1990, it's surprising how well it holds up. This is because the game is better in almost every conceivable way than its predecessor. First of all, the stealth systems are improved. You can now hide under tables and vehicles to stay out of sight, which you will need to put more effort into doing because enemies now have peripheral vision, making it easier for them to catch you. Second are the improvements with the boss battles. Unlike Metal Gear 1, where the majority of the boss battles were mostly just hiding and waiting until you can land a few good shots, the majority of Metal Gear 2's bosses have either a puzzle element or a unique environment, both of which force you to adopt a specific combat strategy. Third, the music is excellent. I don't know how many of you ever played the original Deus Ex, but Metal Gear 2's soundtrack is very similar in structure, sound, variety, and vibe. Both of them perfectly complement the stealth gameplay. Unlike Metal Gear 1, where you're just listening to dun 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 na na 80% of the time. But by far, the biggest improvement is with the story. Though the basic structure is very similar to the first game, where you infiltrate a base called Outer Heaven to destroy Metal Gear, it is here that we are first introduced to the themes that would become commonplace throughout the entire Metal Gear saga. The most prominent being that today's ally can be tomorrow's enemy, due to the world's constantly changing political structure. This fact is demonstrated via most of the characters, who now not only have personalities, but legitimately interesting ones at that. The best examples where characters evoke the theme, though, are the allies from the first game who are reintroduced. Gray Fox, Dr. Madnar, Schneider, all of whom suddenly decide to defect from America to the independent military nation inside Zanzibar. Seriously, there's more betrayal going on in this game than in an anime crossover event, or one of Konami's investor calls circa 2015. Ha! That said, these betrayals are not done for cheap drama. There are very compelling reasons that each character has, which, though villainous, are impossible not to empathize with. Though different in detail, the common pattern in their defections is that they found more respect for their skills as soldiers and researchers in Zanzibar than they did for the American government. Schneider's case is probably the most compelling. He defects because he felt that the government in Zanzibar had more respect for human life than the Americans, and the evidence he cites is when NATO bombed Outer Heaven at the end of the first game, despite the fact that war orphans and refugees were inside. Though obviously because the game was made in 1990 and is comparatively short, it isn't able to do as much with this and other themes like in the subsequent games. But what we got here does get pretty close to quintessential Metal Gear. Nonetheless, the game was still made 3.5 decades ago, so there are still going to be some unavoidable design problems. So, naturally, when you make a sequel, the expectation is that the game's world will be bigger in size. And it is. Zanzibar has a big interconnected complex where you're constantly running back and forth between new and old areas. But the problem is that the locations often look too similar, so keeping track of it all felt dizzying at times. Now sure, this was a problem in Metal Gear 1 and Metal Gear Solid 1, but at least there were fewer areas in Metal Gear 1, and Metal Gear Solid 1's areas were more linear and had enough differentiating features to prevent this problem most of the time. With Metal Gear 2, I just kept getting lost a little too often. Thankfully, those periods of confusion didn't last too long, and I was able to get back into the enjoyable gameplay flow. Now, with every Metal Gear game, there's always one section that we always dread having to do, even for hardcore fans like myself. For MGS1, it's the Palkey sequence. For MGS2, it's the Emma escort mission. For MGS4, it's when you tail the Resistance member in Act 3. In this game, it's the fricking swamp. In order to access a boss fight, you have to follow a very specific invisible path through this swamp. If you tread off the path, it takes Snake a few seconds to move his legs out of the sludge and move at a regular speed again. It's not hard or anything, it's just so tedious. It's so slippery and awkward, like off Jabba the Hutt. It can be done, but okay. And once again, there are certain moments where you say to yourself out loud, how the hell was I supposed to figure that out? Like the tap code to contact Dr. Madnar, for example. But thankfully, they are nowhere near as prominent as they were in the previous game. Aside from a few other very minor issues attributable to archaic game design, I have nothing else negative to say about Metal Gear 2. It's a surprisingly good game. One that I would heartily recommend to pre-existing fans and non-fans alike. Even if the graphics and old-school gameplay don't appeal to you, it's worth muscling through for both the story and so you can see where some of Metal Gear's most cherished elements originated. Yet, as good as I feel Metal Gear 2 is, 30 plus years of technological and artistic advances, along with the fleshing out of the Metal Gear saga, have set it up to return in not just superior form, but maybe something that could stand alongside the best games in the franchise. The only question that remains is how? How could you do a remake or remakes of these games that would make them stand alongside the greats and return the franchise to its former glory? Like I said at the beginning of the video, it feels like there is a near infinite number of ways, and I'm sure that a number of you hardcore fans watching have many interesting ideas, which I would love to hear in the comments section below. To jumpstart the conversation though, I will offer some of the ideas that I've pondered for many years. First, take the two games and put them under one title. Do it kind of like Metal Gear Solid 2, where they had the tanker and plant missions, but instead it will be South Africa and Zanzibar. As for what the title should be, I think it would be poetic and symbolic to just call it Metal Gear. Doing that would give consumers the vibe that it's both a reboot and a remake, something new but something already established. But if you absolutely need a subtitle, call it Metal Gear Outer Heaven. I would be fine with that too. Next, you have to make a young Solid Snake front and center in every aspect of the game, with the story, gameplay, and marketing. This would be the first time we could play an entire Metal Gear game as a younger Solid Snake since 1998. And that alone would be enough to intrigue a new generation of players and old school players like myself. The story needs to focus on two core factors. One, obviously, is how Solid Snake became a legend. We could start with him training under Big Boss. That would not only make for a great tutorial mission, but we could finally see some more of the rapport that they had. Then, when he's in South Africa and Zanzibar, have battles and cutscenes that communicate just how difficult Solid Snake's missions were, and the incomparable ingenuity and badassery with which he handles his tasks. Just don't have him turn into Neo again, for Christ's sake. Now, the other core thing that you have to show is how Snake became disillusioned with his government and burdened by PTSD. This is key because another core theme to the Metal Gear saga is this Nietzschean idea of eternal recurrence, vis-a-vis the sins of the father. It happened to Big Boss, and so the same thing will happen to his son, Solid Snake. But the question is whether or not those patterns of trauma can be overcome. By showing Solid Snake going through some really horrific stuff, like watching NATO bomb Outer Heaven, you can make his eventual conquering of PTSD even more heroic than it already was. Aside from that, it would be useful to show Snake acting like a Maverick-type character. As we learn in the briefing from Metal Gear Solid 1, Snake was blackmailed into going on the mission to Shadow Moses because of bad stuff he did during his time in the military. Maybe show him getting into fights with superior officers due to his drinking problem, but also show him demonstrating unparalleled skill in unconventional ways. Maybe he steals army intel for himself just because he felt like it, something literally no other soldier could do, or would do. And finally, you absolutely must expand upon his friendship with Gray Fox. After Snake rescues him in the first game, show flashback scenes with the two of them. Hell, give us a mission where they're working together and learning from one another leading up to the events of Metal Gear 2. Have them bond over their shared trauma and learning to overcome it. This is something Metal Gear fans have waited their entire lives to see. To watch the most badass character in the series hang out with the second most badass character. I would pay full price for this alone. Now, before I conclude with a brief word on gameplay, we have to address the two biggest lore questions that a remake would pose. The first is, how do you handle the two big bosses? And the second is, how do you handle Big Boss's downfall? Starting with the former, as we learn in Metal Gear Solid 5, the big boss in Metal Gear 1 is not the real big boss, but a body double named Venom Snake. It isn't until Metal Gear 2 that we meet the real deal. Solid Snake doesn't know this, and new fans probably won't know this, but a lot of pre-existing fans will know. So how do you handle this in a way that pleases all parties? In my opinion, I think that 95% of the time, Venom Snake should be played off as the same big boss. Have his big shrapnel horn on his head be covered with a beret. Then, when Snake defeats Venom in a fight, have it be with an explosive. This blows the beret off his head, and Snake sees the corpse with the piece of shrapnel in his head, which he and fans that aren't in the know would think he just got from the explosion. And then Snake won't be able to check on the corpse to see if he's truly dead because the blast is starting to bring the ceiling down upon him and he is forced to escape. Then, if you want to reveal that this isn't the true big boss, do it as a part of a side mission where you play as Gray Fox during his initial infiltration, where he finds a piece of intel from the real big boss to Venom, but before he can make sense of it, he's discovered and captured. That's the best scenario I could come up with. I would personally love to hear alternatives in the comments. As for Big Boss's downfall, again, we know generally why he turned bad. He was a warmonger, and war is bad, yada yada yada. It's the finer details that we don't know about. I think this would be a really cool opportunity to use Oilix and make it a part of Big Boss's true villainy. As we learn in Metal Gear 2, the world is going through an oil crisis, but a scientist named Dr. Marv, working in Zanzibar, discovers an oil-producing microbe called Oilix. This, plus the nuclear-equipped Metal Gear, would not only give Big Boss global supremacy, but also completely destroy his argument that he built Outer Heaven to protect soldiers from predatory governments. Hoarding Metal Gear and Oilix for himself would seem more like an act of resentment against the world and a bid for power, instead of altruism. Nonetheless, it's not like Big Boss is short on any arguments against the world's superpowers, which could lead to some cool philosophical exchanges between him and Solid Snake. Of course, you would have to write the script so that they don't just meet at the end of the game. Maybe you could do a Colonel Conrad and Captain Walker type thing like in Spec Ops: The Line, where they're constantly philosophizing over a radio signal. Or they could just find ways to meet intermittently. That would work too. Finally, in terms of gameplay, just have a main scenario for both along with supplemental side ops. Set those side ops up like the VR missions, but maybe consider giving cool rewards for completing them that you can use in the base game. Weapons, better camo, items, vehicles, etc. Plus, maybe consider doing some of the side ops as pseudo-historical recreations, like in Ground Zeroes, where you can expand upon Snake's early days in the Gulf War, but use locations in South Africa and Zanzibar. These are just a few of my ideas. Like I said, the idea of remaking the original Metal Gear games carries so much potential that I couldn't possibly come up with all the ideas on my own. I hope that the ones I outlined are enough to spark some creativity in your minds so you can leave some of your ideas in the comments section below. And that will do it for me, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, you know the drill. Until next time, remember to stay safe and stay yellow.